You're listening to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Brianna Da Silva, and this is Season 2, Episode 9. And, well, would you look at the date? Kind of curious, seeing as I think the last episode I said Episode 9 was coming out in early January, and it is awkwardly mid-February. Well, I'm sorry about that, y'all. I've been meaning to upload some sort of an announcement in the past month explaining why I've been gone, but I have not been able to do that pretty much for the precise reasons why I haven't been able to upload another episode. So I'm sorry for the lack of explanation. Basically, I've just had various life things getting in the way. I've been kind of stressed with a lot of things, haven't been in the right headspace, and more practically, finances have been a little bit tight, had some unexpected expenses that came up. It was kind of hard to justify spending the money on the production for the podcast when I had other things that I needed to prioritize. But I am back now, and I actually have one person in particular to really thank for that. One of my patrons, Brandon, just became the very first ever patron of Females in Fantasy to increase his pledge to the very highest tier. He is a world deity now. All hail the world deity of Females in Fantasy. And I'm really touched by that because not only has that given me the peace of mind and the confidence to come back and continue working on the podcast, but the reason why it has given me that confidence is because I've reached a milestone with Brandon's support and the support of all of my other patrons. The production costs of the podcast are now half funded. So that means every other episode I am no longer paying for out of pocket. So that's a really big deal. Yeah, huge thank you to Brandon and to everyone that has supported the podcast and to all of you listeners that have been patient with me while I had this kind of a long, unexpected and unexplained hiatus. But thank you everyone. I am very happy to finally share with you all my conversation with Becky Chambers. She and I talked about world building, alien genders, prejudice metaphors, and more. And well, I think it's going to be worth the wait. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Becky. Welcome, Becky, to the Females in Fantasy podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's so awesome to have you on. You know, I'm going to just start off with a little bit of my fangirling, I guess. I have to let you know that The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is my favorite science fiction book.
Wow, that's high praise. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to get into a lot of different things later, but I think it's mainly like the characters and the world building that are my personal favorite. But yeah, so tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into writing. You have a unique and interesting writing journey story. So I'd love for you to kind of get into that and how the publishing process went and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. I've been writing ever since I was tiny. It's just been the way that I feel like I express myself best. But I come from a family that's very involved in space science. My mom is an astrobiology educator. My dad,
awesome.
My dad's, he's retired now, but he was an aerospace engineer. My grandfather was a mathematician. He worked on Apollo and later on the shuttle. So for me, space was just kind of what people did. You know, it was sort of
runs in your blood.
It was my normal, right? So naturally, growing up in that family, I decided to study theater because that was the most logical path. But I kept writing through all of it. And I did work in theater for a while, but I reached a point where I realized, you know, my friends were going out and being very involved in writing one acts and seeing all the other plays that were out there and this and that, whereas I would go home and, you know, watch Star Trek and play video games. And at some point I said, you know, I need to listen to that. I need to pay attention to the stories that are getting me excited and the ones that I love best. And they're not happening in this field. They're happening in science fiction. So I shifted gears and turned my attention to that. And I was writing professionally for a long time before I started, you know, being able to make a living off of writing fiction. I did technical writing, you know, basically translating engineer speak into normal English for a long time. But I was writing stories or trying to write stories through all of that period. With The Long Way, I had this book that had been brewing in the back of my head for a number of years and decided it was finally time to sit down and write it. I was freelancing at the time to pay the bills, and I ran out of money. As happens with freelancing, I was broke, and I had 2 months to fill between that point and the next gig I had lined up. And I was almost done with my manuscript for The Long Way. And I said, okay, well, I can do one of two things here. Either I can drop everything and try to find some work, scramble to find some work to fill that time, or I can try to buy myself that time, essentially. So I turned to Kickstarter. And I set up a small campaign, and it really was just, 2 months of rent and groceries is basically what it covered. And I said, hey, I've got this book. I really want to finish it, and I think you might like to read it. And would you help me out? And to my eternal surprise, it was a success. And that's kind of where it all started. I originally self-published and then was picked up by Hodder and Stoughton about 6 months after that. And from there, it's been a wonderful, crazy ride.
Yeah. It's so interesting the way that you were able to use Kickstarter, because I don't think I've seen anyone do that before. I mean, I'm sure there are people that have done that, but it was the first time that I've seen someone use that in that way for like finishing a book project. Right. So it was really interesting to me. I was like, oh, and she made it work. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I still don't know how exactly, because the thing is, I wasn't planning to self-publish originally.
Yeah.
I knew that traditional publishing would be a better fit for me. I think that self-publishing is great and it's got a lot of strengths, and I don't see it as lesser than traditional publishing at all. It's a fantastic option, and I'm really glad it exists. But the thing with self-publishing is you have to really not only have skill in, but be interested in marketing and self-promotion and really every aspect there is of making a book. And I am not great at marketing and self-promotion. And I knew that going in. I knew that self-publishing would be a real challenge for me because I'm not super skilled at putting myself out there in that way. So I didn't initially have anything to sell, in the campaign. It wasn't, put down $20 and I'll get you a bound copy. I went in there saying, hey, I'm intending to go about this the traditional way, and I'll self-publish if that doesn't work. But yeah, it really surprised me and still surprises me that people were willing to support me just based on an idea, essentially.
Yeah. And you didn't give any, samples of the book or anything at that point. It was basically just kind of pitching the story and the concept. Yeah. So speaking of that story and that concept, so it's an interesting setting, right? It's far in the future. Humanity is spread among the stars. They're interacting with other intelligent creatures. And it's so far in the future that identities, national identities or whatever that we think of here on Earth wouldn't be as important anymore. And where,
right.
It's more like whether they're from, a certain planet or something like that was more what they would identify with. So how did you approach doing the world building for this? On one hand, it's so much of this is trying to imagine how things would be further along. And there's a lot of things that you kind of have to let go of. And I don't know, just what was that like for you?
World building is one of my favorite parts of writing. I think I could just world build forever if I didn't have deadlines, right? Part of that is the freedom that comes with writing science fiction and fantasy, right? You get this blank slate. And I think it's part of what makes this genre really beautiful is that you get to construct your own sandbox. But the flip side of that is you do have to construct it. You do have to take the time to make up the world, right? There were a few, I guess, sort of guiding points I always kept in mind along the way. One is I didn't want humanity to be a monolith, right? There isn't one central human culture. And the same goes for aliens as well. I think you have to have some sort of cultural cohesion in order to do something as big and something that relies on cooperation as much as, going out there and settling other planets requires, but you're not going to have the same groups of people on every world or, even in, different parts of that world, right? So I wanted to make sure that with all my cultures, be they human or alien, that there was, sort of a mainstream, but then plenty of subcultures and fringe groups alongside to show that, we're never going to agree on everything, and people are going to have different senses of identity and going to have different values. And that's going to remain constant, even though our labels for that have changed.
Yeah. And speaking of identity, one of the things that I also found really interesting and the way that it was handled was kind of the way that you approach the concept of gender and even pronouns and how certain things were used. There's this one scene where Rosemary, the main character, where she didn't know what someone's gender was, and part of it because he was an alien. And so right. she was unable to tell. And so there was a gender neutral pronoun that was used. And yeah, I just thought it was kind of interesting thinking about okay, so imagine that we're in the future and we do meet all these other intelligent life forms, and we're trying to understand each other. We have all these differences. And like gender is one of the things that will inevitably be different, right? Certain things are just specific to mammals, or certain things are just specific to humans, or just specific to a certain human culture. And then it's like, like being able to kind of step outside of that and interact with these people that have different experiences of how that works is it's really, really fun to think about. One of the things I really love about this genre.
That's something I really enjoyed writing, and then something that's important for me to have in the books. With all of it, I want to make sure that I'm not writing, a human-centric universe, right? Like humans are not the default template for all life in the universe. And that goes both biologically and culturally, right? I say this with all love for Star Trek, which is, the stories I love best as a kid, and they were just such a huge influence on me. But I mean, there's only so many like people with latex foreheads you can do, right?
Right.
And all of them have the same sort of basic cultures. They all have ideas like marriage and war and, all these things that we take for granted as just religion, something that every culture would absolutely have. But these are all constructs, right? And gender is very much one of them. Gender is absolutely cultural, right? We're talking about gender as separate from biological sex. And even then, humans themselves, we don't fit into a nice, neat binary, right? From a purely physiological point of view. And we certainly don't have the same setup that other animals on this planet have. Nothing else works exactly like we do. And sexual reproduction, where you have two sexes reproducing is not the norm. You have plenty of things that don't require other sexes, or that don't even require a partner at all. That's the standard for most life on Earth. So I think it's kind of arrogant and short-sighted to assume that intelligent life elsewhere is going to have bodies, they're going to reproduce, and they're going to have sex in the same ways that we do. It's laughable. And then by extension, gender is not going to be the same concept, right? With aliens, first of all, do they have a concept of gender? Does that exist? Is it tied to reproduction? What are their visual markers for it? Or is it something communicated another way? Do they have 2? Do they have 4? Do they have 6? Do they, there's no telling. And so I think in that, the scene you described with Rosemary, it's just polite. Honestly, when you run into, if you're standing there and you're talking to a creature, with 6 legs and a weird split face and, gray mottled skin. And what do you say? What do you assume? You can't assume anything about that. Right. So in all of that, I wanted to show that gender is cultural. 1, biology is incredibly diverse. 2, and 3, in order to cooperate in a society that incorporates all of those things, you have to be very open-minded, and you have to be willing to set your own biases aside.
Yeah, I loved also how like you explored some of these different alien species, like how their sexuality works too. Like for example, Syssix, I can't remember what the name was of her species. What are they called?
Oh, Andrisks.
Yes, the Andrisks. How they would have like this really interesting like family structure where they like had different families throughout their life. And there was like the one that raised them, and the one where they were reproducing, and then another where they were raising kids. And I know it's just like, it's one of those things where when you think about it, you're like, yeah, okay. So these ideas like family or like sexuality, or whatever, like, and what we assume would not necessarily apply, it might or it might not apply to another species. And it was just really cool. And it definitely helped me a little bit to kind of like expand my imagination, I think, in the way that I approach these things as well.
Oh, thank you.
Little side note, I love Syssix. I actually have a reptilian character in Elder Scrolls Online named Syssix. So
oh, what a compliment. Thank you. That's fantastic.
So this is going to sound funny when I say this at first, and I hope no one's offended right off the bat, but I'm going to explain what I mean in a second. When I was first reading this book, there were certain kind of details and like nuances and things that were included, I think, especially when dealing with like these different types of characters interacting with each other, where like they're dealing with things like prejudice and trying to be open-minded and trying to understand each other. And I was just like, oh man, this is so good. Like I like expected that you're probably gay or had some sort of like marginalization or some sort of a minority. And then when I saw in your bio that you were, I was like, yes, I knew it. It couldn't have been that good otherwise, which is silly, of course. But what I mean by it couldn't be that good is that usually I think there are certain kind of details and things that people don't think about unless they've experienced it firsthand or unless they're really, really good at listening. And so I picked up on that a little bit. So how do you think that like experience for you personally influenced how you wrote these stories and like what was important to you to include and just things like that?
Well, I think some of the things we've talked about, gender and family in particular, right? I mean, these are things that if you fall anywhere underneath the queer umbrella, they're things you spend a lot of your life thinking about and a lot of your life having to unpack, because those are the things that we're confined by, right? These really rigid definitions of, how to express yourself, who you're allowed to love, what kind of family you're allowed to have. These are some of the most defining things in our lives. It's that sort of catch-22, right? About how you as a person, as a queer person, as a gay person, you're not defined by your sexuality. You're so many other things besides your sexuality, but at the same time, it is this enormous thing. You're absolutely defined by it. It shapes so much of your life and so much of how you interact with people and how you trust people and just how you feel as a citizen, as a member of society, right? So in that, it was very important to me to create a future in which we're represented. And I don't just mean queer people, I just mean people across the board. This is a future in which you can be yourself and in which it's safe. And by safe, I mean, yeah, there's still, space pirates and weird diseases and all that kind of stuff. But right. But you as you are welcome, and I think that's really all of us are in the queer community are ultimately looking for, right? Is that feeling of just being welcome and accepted without there having to be any sort of effort or any sort of obstacles. You just want to exist. I was very intentional in the books about not using terms like gay or queer or having any sort of label for sexuality. This is true for the whole series. People like who they like. I wanted to create a future in which you don't have to come out, because there is no expectation. There's no expectation of straightness, right? There's just, sometimes people are with who they like and people have preferences, sure, but it's incidental. It's not something you need to have a big conversation with your family about. It's not, a label you need to affix to yourself. It's just, who is it that you love best? Who is it that you have relationships with? That's all it comes down to. And so that's what I wanted. I wanted to make sure it was a future in which we don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to fight and we don't have to struggle. You can just love who you love and be who you want to be. And it also colored things outside of sexuality as well. The sort of stuff I've talked about making sure that different cultural norms are respected, making sure that there is a general sense in the galactic mainstream of being open-minded and learning to roll with people's differences. All of that is very much shaped by my life experiences and the challenges I've encountered, the prejudices I've encountered, and imagining, okay, well, how could we do this better?
Yeah, I'm bisexual myself, and sometimes I like to think about like a lot of these labels and kind of like these communities that exist. I think the LGBTQ plus umbrella or queerness or whatever. It's like, I can't help but wonder how much less meaningful that will become over time if we're moving towards, people being accepted and understood and all that, where it's just like, I see like exactly what you're saying. Like I see that being less of a need to really even talk about that so much, and yeah, I like that. I like to think that that's where we're headed, hopefully. Yeah. So one thing that is, I couldn't interview with you without asking your opinions on this. Some people will say that like that it can be problematic to like use imaginary creatures as stand-ins or metaphors for like real life prejudices like racism or homophobia or whatever. And I personally feel that I don't think that applies to your books, because to me, it's like we're kind of exploring what this would actually be like if there was a future where we met other intelligent life forms, which like in my heart of hearts, I hope is our future. That would be awesome. And so it's like, to me, it seems like so natural to kind of expect that some of the similar issues that we have would also extend to trying to understand like, people of other species. And so I don't really see that as problematic, but I don't know. I was just wondering what you think about that.
Right. I mean, I think that's a really complex topic because, yes, there is a problem with that. I remember, I think it's on TV tropes. There's one labeled, it's not gay if it's an alien or something like that, where there's that sort of thing of like, where you have a stand-in because you're not brave enough to actually go there. And I think there's definitely an argument to be made for that. That's true in a lot of respects. I think though, also part of the, simultaneously, not in an exclusive way, I think that part of the power of science fiction is that we are talking about the real world in metaphor, be it through aliens or be it through, planets or worlds or cultures that don't exist, as sort of an alternate tool to dismantling prejudices or taboos or, just sort of rigid ways of thinking. If you say, okay, blank slate, we're not here anymore. We're, 1,000 years in the future. And, we have all these different labels now, but we're dealing with a lot of the same sorts of prejudices, right? Like it may not be racism as we know it, but it's people being prejudiced against different species or against artificial intelligence or all these things, and they're these very recognizable sorts of prejudice and marginalization, but, through a different lens. I think for some people, that's a more effective way to talk about these things because you're taking a step back. You're sort of setting aside all the baggage or maybe the expectations, the biases of the audience themselves, where if you come in and you label something with a label that we have here in the real world, that person is going to make a knee-jerk judgment about it right away, be it a political label or a religious label or what have you. But if you're completely making stuff up and you say, okay, well, AIs aren't given agency over whether or not they have a body. And you as the reader look at it and say, well, that's screwed up. That's wrong. Like, well, okay, why? Why do you think that's wrong? Why do you think it's wrong for that or for us to, say insulting things about particular aliens and their bodies? Like, what does that bother you, but it doesn't bother you in the real world? Does that make sense? It's this way of sort of turning things inside out, of pulling back the curtain and saying, these all prejudice has the same mechanisms. Let's explore this in a way where we can do so sort of maybe a little more calmly and maybe a little more objectively, really pick apart the heart of what we're doing here.
Yeah, and I think people have their guards down when they're reading that kind of a thing,
right.
Because like if they have, certain, how would you say, like sometimes one of the things that makes it hard for someone to say change their mind on an issue is like if they have certain like identity kind of things that are wrapped up in it, or, it has something to do with like their community and like being accepted in their community, or, it has to do with like certain life experiences they've had, or they have certain emotions that are attached to, like you said, like a certain label or a certain kind of a real world example of something. But then if it's in another form, that's not necessarily the case. And I know like I've been that reader before. I've definitely so I know that can happen. I definitely was once years ago, I was reading something and it was a fantasy thing. And there was a fantasy, kind of example of some sort of prejudice. And I remember reading it and I saw myself in the character. And I don't know that I would have been able to see that if it was real life.
Right, exactly. Because you would get defensive.
Exactly.
If somebody was calling you out in an obvious way, you would put your guard up and you would say, oh, well, that's not me. But if you write something that's completely fantastical or completely different and you start to relate to it and then you make the call out in a more subtle sort of way or in a, a roundabout sort of way, then just as you've described, I think that can be a very powerful catalyst for, if not change, at least someone giving something some thought, for unpacking something you might have taken for granted before.
Yeah. And to expand on my own personal experience with that, it was still a long time before that particular issue, before I changed my mind on it. But it planted a seed. Yeah. It can just help someone to see something a little bit differently, too. It doesn't always have to be a major change, but yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing about storytelling, right? It's just sharing ideas. I mean, It so rarely happens that you read one thing. I mean, it does happen where you read something and you're like, oh, my life is forever changed. I will now see the world completely differently because of this. But usually it's a slow burn, right? And that's why it's important to read lots of things or just to expose yourself to lots of different stories because they're all building on top of each other. It's rare to have that one that changes you forever. Usually it's just the amalgamation of story after story after story, where sort of the combined power of all of them is what changes you over time, both the stories themselves and you thinking about it.
Yeah, especially you thinking about it. I think that's the key part because
That's the key.
yeah, if you're changing yourself, ultimately, it's not like they have this like secret power over you, but but it can help you to kind of guide you down that path and to just to think about things in ways that maybe before weren't open to you.
Right, exactly. And the thing with my books is, I mean, I don't have any sort of, I don't know, like set in stone agenda or like thing I'm trying to do, like this is how I want you to think coming out of the books. If all you get out of my books is a fun space adventure, cool. Like honestly, there's value in that. But really all I want is just for people to ask questions. And where those questions take you, that's up to you. But I just hope that people who read my stuff come out of it maybe a little more willing to question or maybe step away from the things that they think are just hard and fast rules about what life is, what society is. That's the most I hope for, is just that you are willing to ask those questions, even if we end up in different places in the end.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, one more thing I have to bring up. So as I mentioned before, one of the reasons why I really enjoy reading books like yours is because it does kind of capture that future that I deep down secretly hope is our future. And that's in contrast to a lot of science fiction, takes an approach that is, warning you of a future that we could have. And it's kind of like, we don't want this to happen. I feel like that's kind of classic. A lot of sci-fi is that way. But yeah, like I love when science fiction can instead be a source of hope and optimism. I think there's value in both, but what do you think about that? Like, why is that the kind of a story that you like to tell?
Well, I take it back. That is also part of my agenda. That is hopeful sci-fi. See, here's the thing. I agree that there is value in both. And I think it makes perfect sense that so much of the science and fiction and fantasy we've seen in recent years tends to be gritty, right? Well, we're seeing a lot of grim dark. We're seeing a lot of, kind of bleak or at least, kind of bittersweet at the most stories. And that makes sense because we're living in scary times, right? We as a species are dealing with problems we've never had to face before. We're dealing with an understanding of our planet and the fragility of it and just the immense interconnectedness of every system, be it natural or human made. It's overwhelming. And I think it's very understandable that we're afraid. And that our stories reflect that, right? Because stories are always an expression of the times in which they're made. So it makes sense to me that we're seeing, not so happy endings or stories that, are gritty and hard around the edges, because that's what we're feeling right now. And I think that's healthy, honestly. I mean, I think it makes for great storytelling. And I think it's, if we were just to sort of plug our ears and not tell stories like that, I think that would be a problem. But equally, it's a problem to only feed yourself with that, to only feed yourself with stories in which the future is going to be difficult and miserable, and you just have to survive.
It's almost demoralized, like it's almost like demotivating and demoralizing,
Yeah, I mean, because the thing is, short term, like we should be ready for a struggle if it comes. But the thing about struggle is you need something more beyond it. What's the thing you're working toward, if not for you, for generations ahead? Like, what's the better future? Because it can't just be surviving. That's not enough. It's never been enough. So I think that hopeful futures, welcoming futures, futures that you actually want to be a part of are really important right now. You have to, steel yourself for the tough stuff, but also hope for something better, because that's ultimately what you're working toward, right? That's what makes the struggle worth it.
I love that. I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been awesome. How can people keep up with you and follow your work?
You can find me online at otherscribbles.com. That's my website. And I have a newsletter that goes out every so often with events, book releases, anything new and exciting that I'm up to.
All right. Well, thank you again. And you have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Becky Chambers. Special thank you to the new deity of Females in Fantasy podcast, Brandon. I may have to create some mythologies and rituals in honor of our new god. If you want to support the show, want to help prevent any more unexpected and unexplained hiatuses, you can support the show at patreon.com/femalesinfantasy. I have some new tiers and some new goodies on there. Also, I want to be real clear that I don't want anyone to feel pressured at all, like especially if you're in a situation like me, if finances are tight or you're a student or anything like that, like please do not feel pressured. Obviously, what's most important to me is that you take what you can from this podcast and that the content inspires you and that it helps with your writing and all that. And if you do want to support the podcast and you don't have the funds to do so, you can also rate and review it on iTunes. That helps a lot. You can share some episodes, with your friends and family and your network online. That also helps a lot too. So there's more than one way that you can help it grow. I appreciate all of that. Next time on the show, we will be hearing from Lindsay Franklin. We'll be talking about a topic that's a little bit different for this show. We'll be talking about faith and how being a person of faith affects the way that she writes fantasy and speculative fiction. It's going to be a good one. I hope you all enjoy it. Well, until then, this has been the Females in Fantasy podcast. I am Brianna Da Silva. Thank you for your support and thank you for listening.